February 26, 1991, late afternoon in the Iraqi desert. Along the Kuwait border, the Republican Guard's Tawakalna division sat entrenched after weeks of anticipation. These were not conscripts or rear-area troops. This was Iraq's elite heavy armor, equipped primarily with Soviet-designed T-72 tanks, organized and trained according to Warsaw Pact doctrine. Their mission was clear and defensive in nature: hold ground, absorb the coalition advance, and destroy attacking armor once it was forced to close to visual range. Weather appeared to favor them. A powerful Shamal sandstorm swept across the battlefield, driving visibility down to a few dozen meters. According to decades of armored warfare theory, such conditions should have frozen maneuver and neutralized long-range fire. From the Iraqi perspective, the logic was sound. Tank combat doctrine taught that long-range engagements depended on optical clarity, laser rangefinding, and stable firing positions. In heavy dust, these advantages were expected to disappear. Coalition aircraft were grounded. Helicopter support was limited. The sandstorm should have restored parity between Iraqi armor and technologically superior Western tanks. Dug-in hull-down positions, pre-registered fire lanes, and massed formations gave the Republican Guard confidence that any American advance would be slow, cautious, and vulnerable. What the Iraqi crews did not know was that the battle they were preparing for no longer existed in the form they understood. The U.S. Army's M1A1 Abrams tanks approaching their positions were not dependent on visible light. They were operating with second-generation thermal imaging systems integrated into stabilized fire control networks. These systems detected long-wave infrared radiation rather than reflected light, allowing gunners to identify targets based on heat differentials rather than shape or contrast. In practical terms, the sandstorm that blinded Iraqi optics did not meaningfully degrade American sensors. The first impacts came without warning. No visible muzzle flashes. No audible approach of enemy engines through the storm. At ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, Iraqi tanks began to be struck with precise kinetic penetrators, often at their most vulnerable points. Crews reported catastrophic losses within seconds. Entire vehicles were destroyed before commanders could even determine the direction of attack. Communications filled with confusion as units attempted to reconcile their training with what they were experiencing. Tanks were being engaged accurately by enemies they could not see, hear, or locate. This opening phase lasted only minutes, but it shattered the assumptions underpinning Iraqi defensive doctrine. The Republican Guard was facing an opponent that could see through environmental obscurance, fire accurately while moving, and engage at ranges the Iraqis believed were impossible under those conditions. The engagement was not unfolding as a conventional armored clash. It was rapidly becoming something closer to a one-sided detection and destruction cycle, driven by sensors, computing power, and crew training rather than armor thickness or numerical strength. As the engagement intensified, Iraqi commanders attempted to impose order on a situation that was already slipping beyond their control. Reports coming back from the forward companies were fragmented and contradictory. Tanks were being destroyed at distances well beyond 2,000 meters, sometimes while stationary, sometimes while maneuvering. Crews insisted the enemy was moving at high speed through zero visibility while maintaining first-round hit probability. To officers trained in Soviet armor doctrine, these claims bordered on the impossible. No tank force was supposed to be able to do that. Not in clear weather and certainly not inside a sandstorm. Standard countermeasures were attempted. Iraqi gunners activated their infrared searchlights, known as Luna systems, mounted coaxially beside the main gun. These devices were designed to project infrared illumination invisible to the naked eye but visible through image intensification scopes. In theory, this would restore limited night fighting capability and allow target acquisition inside the dust cloud. In practice, it produced the opposite effect. The suspended sand particles reflected the infrared energy back into the Iraqi optics, creating intense bloom and backscatter. Gunners effectively blinded themselves, flooding their own displays with noise while gaining no useful target information. At the same time, those active infrared emissions created distinct signatures detectable by American thermal imagers. To Abrams crews, the Iraqi tanks were no longer hidden shapes in a storm. They appeared as bright, unmistakable heat sources against a cooler background. Their engines, exhaust plumes, and recently fired gun barrels glowing clearly on thermal displays. Each activated searchlight became an unintentional beacon, marking a firing position with lethal clarity. Attempts to return fire were largely ineffective. Iraqi fire control systems relied on laser rangefinders operating in wavelengths easily scattered by dust and smoke. Range readings were frequently false or inconsistent, leading to overshoots and missed shots. Stabilization systems were inferior, making accurate fire on the move extremely difficult. By contrast, Abrams fire control computers continuously calculated range, lead, wind, barrel wear, and vehicle motion, allowing accurate engagements while advancing at speed. As losses mounted, Iraqi units attempted maneuver. Dug-in positions were abandoned in favor of aggressive movement intended to close distance and force short-range combat. Engines roared to life as surviving tanks surged forward into the storm, hoping proximity would neutralize American sensor advantage. Instead, movement only increased their thermal visibility. Tracks heated by friction, engines working under load, and dust disturbed by advancing vehicles all enhanced detection rather than reducing it. Within minutes, cohesion began to collapse. Platoons lost contact with company headquarters. Battalion-level coordination dissolved under the speed of the destruction. Tanks that had not yet been hit began reversing or turning independently, seeking cover that no longer provided concealment. The battlefield ceased to function as an organized defense and became a collection of isolated vehicles reacting to unseen fire. The technological asymmetry was no longer abstract. It was now dictating every second of the fight. By the midpoint of the engagement, the psychological dimension of the fight had become as decisive as the physical destruction. Iraqi crews were no longer reacting to identifiable threats but to an environment that appeared hostile in every direction. Tanks were being hit from the front, the flanks, and the rear without any visual confirmation of enemy positions. Radio traffic deteriorated into overlapping warnings and panic, with crews reporting contacts that could not be plotted and ranges that defied doctrinal expectations. The Republican Guard had trained to fight a visible enemy. What they were experiencing was something closer to omnipresent surveillance. From the American side, the engagement followed a very different logic. Abrams units advanced methodically using bounding overwatch formations refined during Cold War training in Europe. Thermal sights allowed gunners to classify targets at distances exceeding 3,000 meters, even through dust and smoke. Identification was not based on silhouette alone but on thermal characteristics: engine placement, exhaust heat, track patterns, and turret geometry. Targets were prioritized and engaged in sequence, often before Iraqi crews realized they had been detected. First-round hit probability was high, and follow-up shots were rarely required. A critical factor was firing on the move. Soviet doctrine emphasized halting to achieve acceptable accuracy at long range. The Abrams, supported by advanced stabilization and ballistic computation, did not need to stop. This allowed American units to maintain momentum, constantly shifting firing positions while continuing to engage. For Iraqi defenders, this eliminated the last reliable cue of enemy location. There were no pauses, no predictable firing points, and no exposed muzzle flashes to orient against. As the Republican Guard attempted to regain initiative, smoke screens were deployed. Chemical smoke grenades designed to block visible light and laser energy filled the desert air, combining with the sandstorm to produce near-total visual obscuration. Under traditional assumptions, this should have forced a pause in the fighting. Instead, the smoke proved largely irrelevant. Thermal imaging systems detected heat sources through the cooler aerosol clouds, rendering the smoke tactically ineffective. Iraqi tanks, still warm from engine operation and earlier firing, stood out even more clearly against the masked background. The realization that concealment no longer worked had immediate consequences. Some crews shut down engines in an attempt to reduce thermal signature, only to discover that a 40-ton steel vehicle retains heat for extended periods, especially in cold night conditions. Others abandoned their vehicles entirely, concluding that remaining inside a clearly detectable target was more dangerous than exposure on foot. These decisions were not irrational. They reflected a rapid collapse of faith in the tank as a protective system. By this stage, the engagement had ceased to resemble a conventional battle. It was an asymmetric, sensor-driven hunt. The Republican Guard's armor, massed and well-prepared, was being dismantled not by overwhelming numbers or air power, but by a system that fused detection, identification, and engagement into a continuous cycle. The remaining Iraqi units were no longer fighting for positional advantage. They were fighting to escape a battlefield that no longer obeyed the rules they had been trained to survive. At higher headquarters, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Reports arriving from brigade and division command posts indicated casualty levels far beyond any previous planning assumption. Entire battalions were listed as non-operational within minutes, not after hours of sustained fighting. This was not attrition in the classical sense. It was sudden system collapse. Iraqi commanders attempted to reconcile incoming data with their maps, minefield overlays, and defensive plans, all of which assumed that the enemy would be forced to reveal itself before inflicting decisive losses. That assumption was now demonstrably false. The engagement at what would later be identified as the Battle of 73 Easting exposed a doctrinal mismatch years in the making. Iraqi armored forces were structured around Soviet concepts emphasizing mass, layered defenses, and optical engagement envelopes. These concepts assumed mutual visibility as a prerequisite for combat. The Abrams force shattered that assumption by separating detection from visibility entirely. Once detected thermally, an Iraqi tank was already functionally defeated, even if it had not yet been fired upon. Reaction time collapsed from minutes to seconds. The disparity was compounded by crew training and command philosophy. U.S. tank crews operated with decentralized execution, allowing platoon and company commanders to exploit fleeting opportunities without waiting for higher approval. Engagement authority was delegated, and sensor data was trusted. Iraqi forces, by contrast, relied on centralized control and confirmation before maneuver. In a battle where targets appeared and disappeared rapidly on thermal displays, this delay was fatal. Decisions lagged behind events that were unfolding at machine speed. As American units continued to advance, they encountered increasing numbers of abandoned vehicles. Many T-72 tanks were intact but empty, their crews having fled after realizing they were being tracked regardless of movement or concealment. Others were destroyed without ever having fired a round. The imbalance was stark. Iraqi formations designed to trade space for time were being erased in place. The sandstorm, once viewed as an equalizer, had instead amplified the technological gap by removing the last remaining advantages of traditional optics. By the time the firing slowed, less than half an hour had passed since the first contact. The Republican Guard's forward armored elements had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The engagement ended not because ammunition ran out or positions were overrun, but because there were no viable targets left capable of coordinated resistance. The battlefield was littered with the remains of a force that, on paper, should have been formidable. What occurred in those 23 minutes was not simply a tactical defeat. It was a demonstration that the balance of armored warfare had shifted decisively. The tank had not become obsolete, but the conditions for its survival had changed. From this point forward, the side that controlled the sensor battle would dictate the outcome long before armor thickness or gun caliber came into play. In the aftermath, analysts began to reconstruct what had actually happened at the technical level, separating battlefield shock from measurable capability. At the center of the engagement was the M1A1 Abrams thermal imaging system, derived from long-wave infrared technology developed during the 1970s and 80s. Unlike image intensification devices, which amplify existing light, thermal imagers detect emitted heat energy. This distinction mattered profoundly. Sand, smoke, and dust particles scatter visible and near-infrared light, but long-wave infrared radiation, operating in the 8 to 12 micrometer band, passes through such obscurance with far less degradation. In effect, the environmental conditions that neutralized Iraqi optics had minimal impact on American sensors. This sensor advantage was tightly integrated with fire control. The Abrams combined thermal sights with laser rangefinding, stabilized gun platforms, and ballistic computers capable of correcting for range, wind speed, barrel wear, vehicle motion, and ammunition type in real time. The result was not just improved visibility, but dramatically shortened kill chains. Detection, identification, aiming, and firing occurred in seconds, often before Iraqi crews understood they were being targeted. This compression of time was decisive. Even well-armored vehicles cannot survive repeated precision hits when reaction windows disappear. The Iraqi T-72, while formidable by earlier Cold War standards, reflected a different technological philosophy. Its fire control systems were adequate in clear conditions but degraded sharply in dust and smoke. Thermal imaging was not standard across Iraqi units, and training emphasized passive defense and massed engagement rather than independent maneuver. The reliance on active infrared illumination, once a strength, became a liability against an opponent operating entirely passively. Every attempt to improve situational awareness increased exposure. The broader implications were quickly recognized beyond the battlefield. Soviet observers and analysts understood that this was not a uniquely Iraqi failure. The same design assumptions shaped much of Warsaw Pact armor. If thermal imaging could negate concealment, smoke, and weather, then traditional defensive planning was fundamentally compromised. The engagement demonstrated that armored warfare had entered an era where information dominance preceded physical contact. A tank that could not see first was unlikely to shoot first, and a tank that did not shoot first was unlikely to survive. For the U.S. Army, the battle validated decades of investment in sensors, training, and crew coordination. For Iraq, it marked the effective end of the Republican Guard as a strategic armored reserve. For the wider military world, it was a warning. Future wars would not be decided solely by numbers or firepower, but by which side controlled the invisible spectrum where detection, data, and decision converged. The destruction of the Republican Guard in those 23 minutes reverberated far beyond the Iraqi desert. When post-war assessments reached foreign military staffs, the conclusions were unsettling. This was not a narrow tactical anomaly or a lucky convergence of weather and positioning. It was a structural revelation. Armored forces built around optical combat assumptions were suddenly exposed as vulnerable in ways no amount of additional steel or manpower could fix. The battlefield had shifted from what crews could see to what sensors could detect, process, and act upon faster than a human opponent could react. In the months that followed, armored doctrines across the world were quietly re-examined. Investments accelerated in thermal imaging, passive sensors, digital fire control, and crew training built around independent action rather than centralized control. The lesson was blunt but unavoidable. Concealment was no longer guaranteed, and surprise increasingly belonged to the side that mastered the electromagnetic spectrum. A tank could be perfectly positioned, well-led, and numerically superior, yet still be tactically irrelevant if it remained blind while the enemy observed in silence. The engagement also reframed how modern war would be perceived by those fighting it. For the Iraqi crews, the experience was not merely defeat but disorientation. They were destroyed by an opponent they could not perceive, operating in conditions that should have offered protection. That psychological fracture mattered. Once soldiers lose confidence in their ability to understand the battlefield, discipline and cohesion erode rapidly, regardless of courage or experience. The M1 Abrams did not end armored warfare, nor did it make other tanks obsolete overnight. What it proved was more precise and more unsettling. In modern combat, survival begins with awareness. Sensors are no longer support tools, they are the primary weapons system. Armor, guns, and numbers follow only after the battle of detection has already been decided. If you want more deep, historically grounded breakdowns of the technologies and doctrines that reshaped modern warfare, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The fog of war may never disappear, but understanding how it's pierced is the first step to seeing the battlefield clearly.